This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today I'm continuing with my Innistrad Midnight Hunt Limited Set review. Over the last few days we've looked at the multicolored, colorless white, blue, and black cards, and today we're looking at red. In this video I'll give my preliminary thoughts on all the red cards in Innistrad Midnight Hunt, and discuss how good I think they're going to be in the new limited format. I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each of these cards, and if you're not familiar with what those grades mean, you can find an explanation in the description. Alright, let's take a look at our first red card. First up, it's Abandon the Post, which for 1 generic and a red is a common sorcery. It says up to 2 target creatures can't block this turn, and it has Flashback, which is back as a returning mechanic, and that means you can pay a cost while this spell's in your graveyard to cast it again and then exile it, and in this case that cost is 3 generic and a red. I'm not a huge fan of this type of card, mostly because it basically does nothing unless you can win the game with it. That said, if you have 6 mana available to cast it both times in a single turn, it does stand a pretty good chance of stealing a win out of nowhere. A card like this is so all in on aggro though that I think we do need to give it a build around grade. If you're not an aggressive deck, you will rarely play this. I'm giving it a D there, and even that might be generous. But if you are an aggro deck, you'll probably play 1 copy of this and feel fine about it. It'll be a nice little role player that can help you win the game late. I'm giving it a C in an aggro deck. Next up, it's Ardent Elementalist, which for 3 generic and a red is a human shaman at common. It's a 2/1, and when it enters the battlefield, you return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. So this will be a pretty nice 2-for-1 most of the time, and the fact that it's a 2/1 really matters because it stands a decent chance of trading with something, in addition to getting you back a key instant or sorcery. This will obviously be at its best in a blue-red deck, but basically any red deck is going to have enough instants and sorceries to want to play Ardent Elementalist. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Bloodthirsty Adversary, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 vampire at mythic rare with haste. When it enters the battlefield, you may pay 2 generic and a red any number of times. When you pay that cost 1 or more times, put that many plus and +1 counters on Bloodthirsty Adversary, then exile up to that many target instant and or sorcery cards with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard, and copy them. You may cast any number of copies without paying their mana costs. This whole adversary cycle is super good. A 2-mana 2/2 with haste is already a solid playable, and in the later game, if you pump mana into this, you can end up copying some spells, and that's going to feel pretty insane, even if you only copy 1. Now, you do need spells of the right cost, but most decks will have 1 or 2 spells that meet the requirement in their graveyard in the later game, and that's plenty, since that will mean this is a pretty powerful 2-for-1. Paying 5 mana for a 3/3 that also copies a cheap spell is pretty great, though I do think it falls a little short of being a bomb. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Brimstone Vandal, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/3 devil at common. It's got menace, and if it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as Brimstone Vandal enters the battlefield, and when day becomes night or night becomes day, Brimstone Vandal deals 1 damage to each opponent. A 3-mana 2/3 with menace is already something you play a decent chunk of the time, so the additional night and day value here is pretty great. I'm not going to go super deep on night and day in this particular video. I will explain it a little bit where it's necessary, but I went pretty deep on what exactly it does in the very first video in this series, which was the multicolored one, and you should check that one out anyway, so go check it out if you want a more detailed explanation of what all this day and night stuff means. But in the case of Brimstone Vandal, what really matters is day and night are going to shift throughout the game, and it makes sure that's going to happen, because when it comes down, it makes it so players start having to keep track of day and night. And so that means it's going to be triggering its ability throughout the game, hitting your opponent for 1 here and there, in addition to being a decently costed creature. And it really looks like red-white is a deck that's about, taking advantage of the day and night cycles changing as much as possible. And this is a nice aggressive creature that fits into that deck that also gives you a good payoff for night and day changing. I think I can see this being a pretty nice little common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Burn Down the House, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a rare sorcery, and it says choose 1. It deals 5 damage to each creature and each planeswalker, or create 3 1/1 red devil creature tokens with, whenever this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. They gain haste until end of turn. This looks quite good. One of the downsides of sweepers is that you draw them sometimes when you're the one who's ahead, and you really need, instead, a way to add to the board and finish off the game. This gives you both of those things. Obviously, the 5 damage to the board part is going to be the more powerful option as it can utterly reshape the game, and if you're behind, it's one of very few cards that can get you out of a horrible situation. Then, when you are ahead, you can just make the Devils, who are pretty obnoxious. I almost want to give this a bomb grade because you get the upside of the first option without the normal downside of Wraths. But the non-sweeper option here is underpowered enough that I think this falls a little short. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Burn the Accursed, which for 4 generic and a red is a common instant. It deals 5 damage to target creature and 2 damage to that creature's controller. If that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. This isn't exactly efficient. Usually when we see these 5 mana to do 5 to a creature thing, they're about a C. You know, they kill things, you'll play them when you need to, but there's much better, more premium removal around. But this adds enough other incidental effects like doing 2 damage to your opponent, which can matter for the black-red deck, which likes for opponents to lose life. And it also exiles the thing it kills, which really matters in a set loaded up with Graveyard Synergy. I think all of that means it gets to C+. Still not premium removal, but it's closer than it would have been otherwise. Next up, it's Cathartic Pyre, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon instant, and it says choose one, deal 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, or discard up to 2 cards, then draw that many cards. So this is premium removal. 2 mana for 3 damage always is, even if it was a sorcery, and this is an instant. And in a pinch, you can use it to rummage twice. You won't be choosing that second option a ton, but sometimes that's what you'll be doing. Like if you really need to find one card in particular, maybe all of your opponent's creatures are X4s or something, and Cathartic Pyre just doesn't do it for you. So it is nice that it has that alternate option, but you're going to cast this as a removal spell like 95% of the time. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Curse of Shaken Faith, which for 1 generic and a red is a rare enchantment or a curse with enchant player. It says whenever enchanted player casts a spell other than the first spell they cast each turn or copies a spell, Curse of Shaken Faith deals 2 damage to them. This isn't really here for limited. The effect it has won't come up often enough for it to be worth doing. All it does is damage too, and doing damage alone and not adding to the board in any way is very rarely worth it in limited. This does have some sideboard potential to be used against someone going crazy with Flashback or Disturb. So they're like casting multiple things in a turn, but that's about it. And even then, it's unlikely that this is going to punish them enough to be worth a card. I think this is an F in your main deck. And I'm going to say like a D is a sideboard card, but that might be generous. Next up, it's Electric Revelation, which for 2 generic and a red is a common instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you discard a card and you draw 2 cards, and it has Flashback for 3 generic and a red. This is an expensive Tormenting Voice, but it's an instant, and it has Flashback. This format does have a graveyard theme for sure, so discarding cards to cast this isn't a huge cost. Still, it doesn't impact the board at all in any way at all, and is pretty replaceable. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Falconrath Perforator, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 vampire at common, and when it attacks, it deals 1 damage to defending player. In a set where this had no synergy at all, this would probably be like a D+. The stats aren't good, and the 1 damage just isn't enough to make up for that. However, this set's black-red archetype has a lot of cards that give you extra effects if your opponent lost life, and it also cares about vampires, and this does both of those things. I think all of that is enough to bump this well into being a solid playable. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Falconrath Pit Fighter, which for 1 red is a 2/1 vampire warrior at rare, and you can pay 1 generic and a red to discard a card and sacrifice a vampire to draw 2 cards. Activate only if an opponent lost life this turn. This is going to be amazing in constructed aggro decks, as 1 mana 2/1s with upside tend to be. It's not going to be quite as good in limited, but it'll still be pretty nice here. It has good stats for the cost, though a 1 mana 2/1 is significantly worse in limited since games tend to go so long. Still, it comes with a reasonable ability too, though it does come with significant setup. Your opponent has to lose life, you have to have a vampire, and you have to discard a card, and pay mana. That's a lot when all you're really doing is giving up 2 cards to get 2 cards. The good news is that the vampire can sacrifice itself to its own ability, and improving your hand in the later part of the game can be a pretty good deal. Giving this a C+. Next up, it's Famished Foragers, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/3 vampire at common. When it enters the battlefield, if an opponent lost life this turn, you add 3 red, and you can pay 2 generic and a red to discard a card and draw a card. This is pretty cool. A 4 mana 4/3 is sort of passable already, and this will often be able to come down and give you some mana, which, if nothing else, you can use to use that rummage ability. Sometimes it will enable a pretty impressive double spell turn 2, and when it does that, it's going to feel amazing. Now, you have to both cause your opponent to lose the life and have a spell you can cast when you play this with the mana it gives you, and that's not guaranteed, but sometimes that's what this will do, and it will be pretty impressive when it does. This card has a very reasonable baseline and a pretty nice ceiling. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Fangblade Brigand, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/4 human werewolf at uncommon. You can pay 1 generic and a red, and it gets +1/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn, and it has Daybound. So earlier we saw a card that makes it day if it's not already night or day within the game. The other way to make day and night start to get tracked within the game is to play a creature with Daybound like Fangblade Brigand. From that point on, day and night will be tracked if they weren't already. And in addition to that, Daybound and Nightbound, what those mechanics mean is that if it's daytime already in the game, Fangblade Brigand is the part that comes into play when you pay your 4 mana, but if it's nighttime within the game already, Fangblade Eviscerator is what's going to come into the game. So Fangblade Eviscerator is a 4/5 with the same first ability, 1 generic and a red, to give +1/+0 and first strike to itself until end of turn, but it has another ability too. You can pay 4 generic and a red, and creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn. So some significant percentage of the time you'll be paying 4 for a 4/5 with all of those abilities, and even when it's not coming into play that way, or even if it never transforms, the front part of this card is a pretty darn good card. It would probably be a B- all on its own. It has an activated ability that makes it incredibly difficult to block effectively, and it just gets crazier when the other side of the card comes into play, when it becomes night. This is an amazing uncommon. I think it's a B+. Next up, it's Festival Crasher, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/3 devil at common, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. This has a pretty medium baseline. A 2-mana 1/3 these days isn't especially good, but it does have some pretty real upside, and the threat of activation matters. If your opponent just has a 2/2 and you attack with this and leave mana up, they just can't afford to block it. Chaining multiple spells together is the dream, but don't count on making that happen a ton in Limited. This will make the cut in decks with a decent number of spells, but it's never going to be something very exciting. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Flame Channeler, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 human wizard at uncommon, and whenever a spell you control deals damage, you transform Flame Channeler, and it becomes Embodiment of Flame, which is a 3/3 elemental wizard, and whenever a spell you control deals damage, you put a flame counter on Embodiment of Flame, and you can pay 1 generic and remove a flame counter from Embodiment of Flame to exile the top card of your library, and you can play that card this turn. So in Limited, you're generally not going to have a ton of spells that do damage, so transforming this isn't going to be a foregone conclusion. The good news, though, is it is still a 2-mana 2/2, so you're going to be playing it in any deck that even just has one way of doing damage to something with a spell, because the upside of transforming it matters. I mean, you need more damaging spells to really abuse the other side, but the fact that this becomes a 3/3 definitely matters. It does feel like this is going to be more of a constructed card in the sense that you can just, build a burn deck and construct it, and that's not really possible in Limited, and if you're doing that in Constructed, this thing's going to transform easily and give you all kinds of cards. But, Red, and we've already seen some of them, Red has a decent number of ways to do damage. Having 1 to 3 ways to do that in your deck isn't unlikely. And sometimes you'll have more, and it will be even better, but I think this is a pretty nice uncommon overall, just because it has such a reasonable baseline as a bear, and a pretty impressive ceiling as Embodiment of Flame. Still, it's hard enough to transform it that I can't really give it more than a C+. Next up, it's Geist Flame Reservoir, which for 2 generic and a red is a rare artifact, and it says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a charge counter on Geist Flame Reservoir. You can pay 1 generic and a red and tap it to remove any number of charge counters from it, and it deals that much damage to any target, and you can pay 1 generic and a red to exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. This is pretty cool. One part of the card can turn into a source of removal, or help you finish off the opponent. Meanwhile, the second part of the card can help you generate some serious card advantage, and basically help you find more spells to put more charge counters on the reservoir. Now, having to pay 2 for the pseudo-draw effect is pretty rough, and makes it a little less likely you'll be able to play what you hit. Keep in mind that it does let you play lands, so never play a land before using this ability if you want to get full value. Basically though, if a game goes long, this can both generate card advantage and kill stuff, and that can be a real boon, but keep in mind that it will do stone nothing the turn you play it most of the time, and that's a real liability. Obviously, you'll really need to be in the blue-red spells deck to fully take advantage of it too. If you don't have enough spells for charge counters, the card isn't worth it most of the time. So what does all that mean? Probably that this is a build-around and a kind of clunky one. I think it's probably a D in your typical red deck, and probably a B in a blue-red spells deck that really gets there. So there's a pretty wide difference between those two, and that's how this is going to play out. And that means, taking it super early, probably not a great idea because you have to end up in a very specific deck to make it work. But if you find yourself in either red or blue and things are looking okay, taking this with a sort of high pick isn't a bad idea. Next up, it's Harvest-Tide Infiltrator, a common human werewolf. It's a 3/2, it costs 2 generic and a red, and it has Trample and Daybound. The other side is Harvest-Tide Assailant, which is a 4/4 werewolf with Trample and Nightbound. So again, if you play this and it's already daytime, the Harvest-Tide Infiltrator comes into play first. But if it's already nighttime within the game, you'll be playing a 3-mana 4/4 with Trample. And that's some really serious upside, especially because the front of the card isn't terrible. I mean, a 3-mana 3/2 with Trample is not great. It's probably a C-, but the serious upside that this will be a 4/4 Trampler sometimes, plus it has a relevant creature type in the format, I think all of that makes this a pretty nice common, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Immolation, which for 1 red mana is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature, and enchanted creature gets +2/-2. We've seen this before, and it's kind of like red's Deadweight. It isn't quite as good as Deadweight in most situations, because with Deadweight, you can put it on a creature that you just want to weaken, and it doesn't help the creature at all. With Immolation, pumping a creature's power can be a liability, but on the flip side, you can also put this on one of your creatures if you need to do a little bit of extra damage. You need to put it on a creature that's bigger than X2, but that is some decent additional upside. And the fact that you can just pay 1 to kill your opponent's X2s is pretty good. So it's not quite premium removal, but it's a nice common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Hult Harrier, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 wolf at common, and you can pay 3 generic and a red to make a creature unable to block this turn. This is a bear that has the ability to stay relevant all game long because it can make things unable to block it. Now, the ability is quite pricey, and you'll normally only be able to make one thing unable to block, but it is an ability that your opponent has to account for in the late game, as making one thing unable to block can really help someone find lethal out of nowhere. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Light Up the Night, which for X and a red is a rare sorcery, and it deals X damage to any target. It deals X plus 1 damage instead if that target is a creature or planeswalker. And it's got flashback for 3 generic and a red, and remove X loyalty counters from among planeswalkers you control. If you cast this spell this way, X can't be 0. So you're basically never flashing this back in limited, but that's okay because it's an incredibly efficient removal spell that can also go for your opponent's dome. It's definitely premium removal and potentially also a finisher. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Lunar Frenzy, which for X and a red is an uncommon instant, and it says target creature you control gets +X+0 and gains first strike and trample until end of turn. Seems kind of like a flavor fail that they didn't put a line on this that transforms something, but I guess with Daybound and Nightbound that's not supposed to happen, so maybe that's why they didn't do it. But anyway, this is a solid trick for aggro decks. For 1 red, it can give first strike and trample, and sometimes that's alright. But if you have extra mana lying around, it can turn a situation into a nightmare for your opponent, since it will allow pretty much any creature to win combat and do significant damage to the opponent. The fact it's customizable is really nice. Keep in mind, it is still a trick. I'm pretty high on this trick, but it's pretty difficult for a trick to ever be much more than a solid playable just because of how situational they are. But this one can do some serious work, and that's enough for this trick to be a C, instead of like a D+ like a lot of them are. Next up, it's Moonrager's Slash, which for 2 generic and a red is a common instant. It costs 2 less to cast if it's night, and it deals 3 damage to any target. Lightning Bolt is pretty sweet. 3 mana to do 3 to any target is already a premium removal spell in limited that you would always play, and this will sometimes just be Lightning Bolt. This is easily premium and probably red's best common. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Moonveil Regent, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/4 dragon at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, and whenever you cast a spell, you may discard your hand. If you do, draw a card for each of that spell's colors, and when it dies, it deals X damage to any target, where X is the number of colors among permanents you control. A 4-mana 4/4 flyer is obviously great, and this one has tons of upside. Most limited decks will only be 2 colors, maybe you're splashing a third one, so when it dies, it will usually do at least 2 to something, and that's actually a pretty big deal since it can hit anything. That means you'll usually be able to get a 2-for-1 out of it. Additionally, the spell trigger effect is real too. Most of the time, you're just going to be drawing like 1 card, but if your hand is empty or close to it, tacking a rummage onto your instants and sorceries isn't a bad thing. You may not always want to discard your hand, but it will definitely come up in situations where you do. So in short, this is a big flyer that lets you draw cards, and it kills stuff even if it gets destroyed right away. I think that's enough for it to reach into the lower bomb range. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Mounted Dread Knight, which for 4 generic and a red is a 5/4 vampire knight at common. It enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it if an opponent lost life this turn. This has an alright baseline, and sometimes it'll be pretty big. Not a bad thing to have at the top of your curve. I think it's a C. Next up, it's Neonates Rush, which for 2 generic and a red is a common instant. It costs 1 less to cast if you control a vampire, and it deals 1 damage to target creature and 1 damage to its controller. Draw a card. When you manage to kill a creature with this, it's going to feel incredible. When you can't, this is less true. However, it is still an enabler for all these pseudo-bloodthirst effects we've seen in this video and throughout the week. And it replaces itself. And it will also cost 2 mana on a regular basis, making the outcome a lot more palatable. So you don't even have to always kill something with this for this to feel alright. You generally want to for it to be at its best, but I think it's just a solid playable, especially in the black-red deck. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Obsessive Astronomer. For 1 generic and a red, it gives you a 2/2 human wizard at uncommon. If it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as Obsessive Astronomer enters the battlefield. And whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, you discard up to 2 cards, then draw that many cards. Rummaging a few times a game with this is fine, though not exactly game-breaking. It does have decent stats and a decent ability. It's kind of a textbook C. Next up, it's Pax Betrayal, which for 2 generic and a red is a common sorcery. It says gain control of target creature until end of turn, and tap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn. If you control a wolf or werewolf, you scry 2. So, we just came off Forgotten Realms where a card like this was one of the best cards in the format, but that was highly unusual. There isn't much of a sacrifice deck in red this time around, with black-white being the place where you'll find those effects the most. So this just ends up being a threaten that lets you scry sometimes, and that's not great, as using this card is only worth it if you can actually kill your opponent with it. Otherwise, you go down a card just to do damage, and unless that's immediately going to cause your opponent to lose, you're going to be in trouble. It can do some work in helping aggro decks close out the game, but the fact that it's useless up until that point makes it really hard to want to play this card in an ideal scenario. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Play with Fire, which for 1 red mana is an uncommon instant. It deals 2 damage to any target. If a player is dealt damage this way, you scry 1. So this is shock with upside, and that's something I can get behind. It will often be able to kill 3 and 4 drops for only a single mana, and that's great. And in a pinch, it can go for your opponent and give you a bit of card selection. You'll always have something to do with this, and it will often be premium removal. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Purifying Dragon, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 4/3 dragon at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it attacks, it deals 1 damage to target creature defending player controls. If that creature is a zombie, it deals 2 damage to it instead. So this has really good stats to start with. A 5 mana 4/3 flyer is pretty frightening and limited, but it also comes with the ability to kill small stuff when it attacks, and the fact it does 2 damage to a zombie isn't minor upside in this format. There's a lot of zombies running around, and this is going to be able to kill a lot of them. 2 damage is a lot for most zombies. This is a great uncommon. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Raise the Effigy, which for 1 red mana is a common instant, and it says choose 1, destroy target artifact, or target attacking creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. This format doesn't have a ton of artifacts, but having the option to destroy an artifact on what is also a combat trick certainly makes this better. The rate you get on the trick isn't amazing, and you can only use it on an attacking creature, but that's not a huge deal. Most of the time you want to be using tricks on attacking creatures anyway. I think this is a C-. Next up, it's Reckless Stormseeker, which is 2 generic and a red for a 2/3 werewolf, human werewolf at rare, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains haste until end of turn, and it has Daybound, so that's the side that comes into play if it is daytime when it enters the battlefield, or if it's nighttime and then it becomes day. And the other side is Stormcharge Slasher, which is a 3/4 werewolf, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gets +2/+0 and gains trample and haste until end of turn, and it has Nightbound. So if it's day and becomes night while the Stormseeker is in play, it'll become Stormcharge Slasher, or if it's already night when you cast this, it will be Stormcharge Slasher when it enters the battlefield. This looks really good. Like a lot of these werewolves, just the human side would be pretty nice. It will impact the board right away since it can come down and pump a creature that turn. Note, by the way, it can pump itself, so it can be a 3/3 with haste if that suits you on a particular turn. Basically, the front side of the card is an upgraded version of Valor Singer, a card that was pretty decent that we just saw in Forgotten Realms, and that's just the front side of this card. Then when it's nighttime, you get an insanely powerful werewolf, one that gives a bigger boost and trample to go along with haste. In other words, if it is nighttime and you play this, you just played a 3 mana 5/4 with trample and haste because it can target itself. Yeah, this thing is going to really make the game a challenge for your opponent on both sides, as both are very capable of helping you push through a ton of damage. I think this is a very high pick, though it does fall a little bit short of being a bomb. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Seize the Storm, which for 4 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery. It says create a red elemental creature token with trample, and this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard, plus the number of cards with flashback you own in exile, and it has flashback for 6 generic and a red. So you need to get a 4/4 out of this for it to feel reasonable, and even that's not going to feel great. Up front, if that's all this was, it would be kind of hard to build around this and actually make a big enough creature consistently enough for this to be especially good. The fact that it has flashback improves it some. You're not going to be getting an efficient token out of it most of the time, but you do get 2 bodies out of 1 card, and theoretically, by the time you flash it back, it'll be a bigger token. And, this format has lots of ways to load the graveyards. The blue-red deck is already a spell-heavy deck that ideally, I think, based on a lot of the cards we've seen, will have like 10 spells in it. So I think Seize the Storm looks pretty good. Is it the spell payoff that you're waiting for to really pull your deck together? Probably not in most situations, but it is another spell payoff your deck can have that can add to its synergy. I think it's probably a C+. Next up, it's Smoldering Egg, which for 1 generic and a red is a 0/4 dragon egg. At rare, it's a defender. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a number of ember counters on Smoldering Egg equal to the amount of mana spent to cast that spell. Then a Smoldering Egg has 7 or more ember counters on it, remove them, and transform it. And then it becomes Ashmouth Dragon, a 4/4 dragon with flying, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it deals 2 damage to any target. The egg is a decent blocker early, and one that will eventually become a scary flyer with a powerful spell payoff ability. It will take this egg a while to hatch in most situations, but the blue-red deck likely plays enough spells most of the time to make this a perfectly playable card. It isn't going to transform, even in those decks, until the mid to late game, but that's okay because a 4/4 flyer is relevant pretty much all game long. It also gets a bonus from flashback being a thing, because if you drew this after you're out of spells, it would be pretty rough in a lot of formats, but in this format, you're likely to have a couple of flashback spells in your graveyard, and for some of them, just casting 1 or 2 will be enough to transform this, because it doesn't look at mana value, it looks at the mana you spend to cast the spell. That said, it still means it will take a while to transform in most cases, but like I said, that 4/4 dragon is a big deal basically on any board you'll see. I think this is a B. It's obviously something of a build around, but I think the ceiling on it's high enough that you should value it like a B, even in like a pack 1, pick 1 situation. Next up, it's Spell Rune Painter, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/3 human shaman werewolf at uncommon, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and it has Daybound. The other side, the nighttime side, is Spell Rune Howler, a 3/4 werewolf, which gets +2/+2 until end of turn when you cast an instant or sorcery spell. So, a 3-mana 2/3 that gets +1/+1 when you cast an instant or sorcery is already a decent card. It has the kind of stats that make it kind of a pain to block or attack into against an opponent who has mana up and cards in hand. It would probably be a C if that's all this card was, but of course it's a werewolf, and if it's nighttime, you get a bigger creature that gets even bigger when you cast those spells. This looks like a pretty serious beating, especially in a spell deck. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Stolen Vitality, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. It says target creature gets +3/+1 until end of turn. If it's your turn, that creature gains trample until end of turn. Otherwise, it gains first strike until end of turn. This is a decent trick that gives you lethal out of nowhere sometimes, and one that can also be used defensively, thanks to first strike. Now, using a trick defensively is definitely not optimal, but it is upside on this card. I don't love that it only bumps toughness by 1, and that means when you're the one who's attacking, your creature's already going to need significant toughness to not also die in combat. But at least it does boost toughness some, and the additional damage you do sort of balances that out a little bit, plus, the additional sort of split card option of this being a more defensive trick. Overall, this is something you'll play some in your really aggressive decks, but you'll also cut it a decent chunk of the time. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Sunstreak Phoenix, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4/2 Phoenix at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, and if it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as it enters the battlefield. And whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, you may pay 1 generic and a red, and if you do, you return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. I really like that the Phoenixes on this plane are apparently herons. I know herons are like a thing on this plane, but it's kind of interesting to see one as a Phoenix. Anyway, a 4-mana 4/2 flyer is a great threat to have, and this one doesn't plan on staying dead for long. Just having a couple of mana up isn't a huge challenge, and night and day changing is going to be a big part of this format. It's going to change on your opponent's turn, it's going to change on your turn. This Phoenix makes sure that it's going to be tracked, even if you and your opponent never play another card that tracks this. The Phoenix makes sure it's going to be tracked, and that means that it's going to be able to keep coming back and forth throughout the game. And a 4/2 flyer that won't stay dead is kind of a big deal. I mean, it's just going to keep coming back and keep attacking your opponent, and it can do it pretty aggressively. Alternatively, it can also block really well. If you're the one who's behind, you can just get it back and use it to block your opponent's stuff, trade with it usually because of the high power. It does come into play tapped, but that's a reasonable downside. I think this is a huge bomb. I think it's an A+. It's just hard to beat a card like this in a normal way. Like, your opponent just can't beat this card without using some card that involves exiling it or something like that. Next up, it's Tavern Ruffian, which for 3 generic and a red is a 2/5 human warrior werewolf. At common, it's got Daybound. And the other side, the Nightbound side, is a 6/5. So, in most formats, a 4-mana 2/5 isn't something that red decks are super interested in, though those are fairly reasonable defensive stats. However, this is of course a werewolf, and that means if it's already nighttime, you get a 4-mana 6/5, and it also means that it can become a 4-mana 6/5 at some point in the game, even if it enters as Tavern Ruffian, and that's a pretty nice deal. It isn't always going to be super easy to control what time of day it is, but this seems like a pretty good common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Thermo Alchemist, which for 1 generic and a red is a 0/3 uncommon human shaman with Defender. When you tap it, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you untap it. So this is a reprint. He was around for our last trip to Innistrad, and he was a common then, if you can believe that. He was an excellent spell build around then and did a ton of damage, and the great thing about him too is a 2-mana 0/3 that can tap to do 1 to your opponent is already kind of a passable card, and the fact that sometimes it will be doing 2 in a turn is amazing. I don't think one really has to give this a build around grade because it has such a reasonable floor. I think you can take this pretty highly, and it's going to be completely insane if you really get there in a blue-red spells deck. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Village Watch, which for 4 generic and a red is a 4/3 human werewolf at uncommon with haste, and it has Daybound. The nighttime side is a 5/4 with wolves, and werewolves you control have haste. A 5-mana 4/3 with haste isn't great, but the fact that this can be a 5/4 sometimes is pretty nice. Ideally, you want it to be night when this comes down for the mana investment to feel best, because a 5-mana 4/3 with haste is often just going to attack and die. Like, your opponent can block it relatively easily and usually trade up for it. Like, those stats, this is one of the few werewolves where the stats on the front are really kind of letting me down. But luckily, the other side is larger and gives your other wolves and werewolves haste. So the overall package here is still a pretty nice card, though not really one you want to be taking super highly, I don't think. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Valderrian Ambusher, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 vampire archer at uncommon. And when it enters the battlefield, if an opponent lost life this turn, it deals X damage to up to 1 target creature or planeswalker, where X is the number of vampires you control. So, on its own, assuming your opponent has lost life, this is a 3-mana 2/2 that does 1 damage to a creature. That's not bad. I mean, that's a card that makes the cut sometimes. And there are going to be times where this does a whole lot more damage and really feels like a Flame Tongue Kavu effect. It does ask you to do a couple of things. First, you have to find a way to damage your opponent. And second, you need several vampires in your deck for this to really be at its best. But I feel like if you're in red, you're going to have like 4 or 5 vampires, and that's probably enough for this to be fine. And if you're in black-red, there's a good chance you got like 10 vampires, and in that case, it's going to be really good. I think overall, it's really hard not to see this as a 2-for-1, and that's what it'll be probably like half the time. The other half of the time, it's going to be a Grey Ogre, and that's rough, but I think the ceiling's high enough that I want to give it a B-. Next up, it's our last red card, which is Valderran Stinger, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 vampire warrior. At common, it has first strike as long as it's attacking, and you can pay 2 generic and a red to give it +2/+0 until end of turn. Your opponent does have to respect this as an attacker if you have the mana up, so this gives you a good way to chip in for 1 damage to activate your Bloodthirst stuff, giving it a C. So, those are my thoughts on all the red cards in Innistrad Midnight Hunt. Tomorrow I'll be wrapping up the card-by-card portion of the set review with a look at green. Even after that, there are more videos to come on this new format, including a top 10 on the biggest bombs in the format, an archetype guide, a video giving my picks for the best commons in the format, and starting next week, draft videos. If you want to stay aware of all that content and more, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you enjoyed this video in particular, please like it and share it, and if you're looking for the rest of the set review, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.